Thanks very much for having me speak at the event today. I really appreciate the opportunity. So my name is Mathieu Gorge. I'm the founder and CEO of VG Trust, which, despite my French accent, is actually an Irish company that I started in Dublin nearly 18 years ago now. We started it as value-added resellers for network security. We then went on to delivering a lot of face-to-face training around data privacy, payment security, and also generic cybersecurity. Evolved into the e-learning space, and fast forward to today, we're a provider of software as a service, governance, risk compliance tools, and integrated risk management tools. We have an award-winning solution called VG1, which allows our clients to prepare for, validate, and manage continuous compliance with currently 100 plus legal and industry standards around information governance, compliance, and data security. Usual suspects: HIPAA, PCI, ISO, CMMC, COBIT, NIST, and so on. What I'm going to be talking about today is the concept of cyber accountability with regards to data management. I'll be touching on risk appetite as well. And some of those concepts, in fact, most of them you're probably very familiar with, but I think that perhaps there's a slightly different slant on those concepts based on the work that I do. I should also mention that I run a not-for-profit think tank called the VG Trust Global Advisory Board that some of you might have heard of. We currently have 700 members from 30 countries, board of directors, so C-level folks, CROs, CISOs, regulators, law enforcement like FBI, Interpol, NYPD, French police, Irish police, UK police, and so on. And as John said, my claim to fame is that I wrote a book called The Cyber Elephant in the Boardroom that was published by Forbes in digital format last year in November, and in physical format in March this year, and which was number one on Amazon for a little while. I spoke about VG1 already, so I'm going to move quickly on that one. What I like to always do is to start by talking about the overall risk landscape that we're faced with. And so one of the issues that I think we have is that we tend to focus, generally speaking, on cyber risk and on disaster recovery, business continuity, and so on. And whilst we have to do that, my advice would be to look at risk as 4 key areas that I call bubbles of risks, and they apply to any organization, regardless of the size of the organization. So they are strategic geopolitical risk, financial, operational, and contractual risk, reputational, brand management, quality management, and then cyber. Now, if I take them one by one, let's talk about strategic geopolitical risk. So right now, there are 3 main examples of risks that you may or may not have considered. The first one, which you may think doesn't really apply in the US, is the risk created by Brexit for data protection and cybersecurity. So the United Kingdom decided to leave the European Union. They were following GDPR before they left. In fact, they had, at the time, issued the biggest fines under GDPR, respectively for Marriott and British Airways. But the fact that they are now out of the European Union meant that they needed to apply to get adequacy for GDPR, which we did get. But what that actually means is that the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office in the UK, is now independent and can make their own decisions with regards to where they want to take data protection. And so that is creating some issues, because the problem here is that whilst we might have had, you do business between the US and the EU, and you would have had some policies and procedures to do that. Now you're going to have policies and procedures pertaining specifically to the UK. So that's one example. The other example is the impact of a new administration like the Biden administration here in the US, focusing really on critical infrastructure. That was always their plan, but they accelerated that because of the Colonial Pipeline issue. Another example is what's happening in Ireland with the health service executive, where all of the hospitals went down for the guts of 6 weeks, and the focus on health information in that region. And then finally, another example of strategic geopolitical risks that may or may not affect you is the fact that with what's happening in the Middle East, we know that when there's turmoil over there and there's a risk of physical terrorism, that is more and more associated with cyber attacks. And so a number of experts have explained that they expect the next terrorism attacks to be a mix of physical attacks and cyber attacks on major Western countries. And so that's something that we need to prepare for. Financial and operational and contractual risk is much more easy to describe. It's your relationship with your partners, with your vendors. But on that front, we should pay attention to third parties and fourth parties because they bring a lot of risk. The next one is reputation, brand management, and quality, and I'm going to talk about that again. And then finally, there's everything that has to do with cyber. And I mentioned a lot of standards and a lot of regulations earlier on. This is very well defined, and to some extent, it's probably the easiest part to deal with because there are good practices and there are a lot of controls that are available for us to use as benchmarks, and sometimes we just have to comply with them. So if I move to the next part of what I wanted to cover, you've probably covered that in some of the previous sessions, but we've seen a number of attacks this year. We've seen Colonial Pipeline, JBS Foods, we've seen attacks on water systems. Obviously, we saw SolarWinds, Microsoft Exchange, and a few others. And what we're seeing is that the people that are the most impacted are not necessarily just the private wealthy businesses. They're still impacted. However, we're seeing that small and medium businesses are much more impacted, especially with ransomware. But mostly the people that are most impacted are Joe Public, that is to say you and I. And so the attacks are really impacting us as citizens and the way we live on a daily basis. So access to healthcare, I spoke about the health executive in Ireland, access to energy with the Colonial Pipeline, access to funds with a number of banks being put offline for a while, disruption to transportation. So that's the way we live every day. And we are certainly seeing that most of the attacks are perhaps on national infrastructure, but they actually impact Joe Public. And that is something that we as an industry need to pay very close attention to. And I often talk about critical infrastructure protection being the highest priority. With us having, I would contend that any of you on this call today at the conference, you probably have 3 or 4 connected devices on you right now. And then when you get home, you could have up to 25, maybe even 50 for the larger estates that some of you might have. So this is your critical infrastructure. So this is your personal critical infrastructure that you need to protect. So we've seen Amazon and more recently WhatsApp getting massive fines under GDPR. And so obviously those fines are going to be appealed. And if it's anything like Marriott and like British Airways, you can expect that the fine that will end up being paid will be in the region of 20% of the fines that are actually being proposed or being imposed at the moment. But the reality is that we're also seeing smaller organizations being fined, and not just European organizations, but also non-European organizations that are in scope for GDPR. I just want to touch very briefly on digitization and the impact that COVID had. So if you look at the global context from March 2020, in and around the 13th of March, most organizations went from having 10 to 20% of their workforce being remote or being people that were traveling to maybe 90 to 100%. So that completely changed the way we were working. So we've also seen a number of organizations that were telling us, well, we can't digitize because it's going to take too long, and we need to think about security and compliance. And we're taking this slowly. It's going to take 2 years to 3 years to digitize. They suddenly had no choice but to digitize. So what did they do? They started digitizing at the cost of compliance and security, because the priority was time to market. It wasn't to be compliant or to be secure. Normally, when we go through a normal digitization process, we are in a state where everything is frozen. We change it and then we refreeze it in a way that we can maintain it. But in the last 16 months, we've seen people making systems available to remote workers that they wouldn't have dreamt of making available in the past. We've seen people digitizing services that are potentially risky in less than 3 months, and this is really augmenting the risk surface, because there was no involvement of security or compliance in the planning stage. There was very little vendor due diligence or testing of their capabilities. It should have been the old Microsoft system from the early 2000s, security by design, default, and deployment. But it was just like, let's just deploy and we'll worry about security after that. There's been very little mapping of the data flow from a security and legal compliance perspective in those digitization processes. And that really extended the risk surface for many organizations. Moreover, I think that I spoke about the human error earlier on. The ongoing training for employees was not there, and sometimes it's still not there. And one of the other issues that we have is that I often say that security is a journey and it's not a destination. So you get a few pit stops along the way, at which point you might be compliant with XYZ and regulation 1, 2, 3, but the minute you rest on your laurels, your risk surface augments again. And so I think it's fair to say that you need to make security a continuous process, and we kind of lost that in COVID. We also end up with a void whereby we had all of those people that were working from home, probably on their home devices, access to corporate systems and corporate data from home devices. After a few months, we tried to put in like strong authentication, VPNs, and so on. After the panic of staying alive and staying in business passed. And now we end up with a lot of corporate data on home devices that are no longer being used because the companies are taking the right steps. And so what happens to all of that data that we built between March 2020 and say September 2021? How are we going to purge that data and make sure that we don't have that kind of additional attack surface? Because the bad guys are aware that we have all of that. And then finally, cyber insurance. We've seen a number of cyber insurance claims being denied during COVID, and we're seeing cyber insurance prices going up. And I think that's kind of a logical response to what's been happening in the market. But the reality is that we really need to regain control of the process. So when I look at the global compliance landscape here, I see that we've got laws, regulations, we've got standards, and we've got frameworks. So I picked on a few of them, right, just to set the scene. HIPAA, PCI, 3DS, and that's replacing PADSS. We've got GDPR, CCPA. CCPA now has a lot of little cousins within the US, with other states looking at it and implementing it, like Virginia and so on. We've got FTC, SEC, we've got FINRA, we've got cybersecurity stuff from the FDA, and so on and so on. And the reality is that where we need to start thinking is, where are we with regards to the concept of cyber accountability? And so cyber accountability is really a process whereby any organization can say that at any given time they were in control of what was happening, and they can trace back any of the transaction relating to their systems and to their data. And this is not a new concept. You find it in PCI DSS. You find it throughout PCI DSS. You also find it in GDPR. So I picked on the website from the Irish Data Protection Commissioner's Office, but basically what it's saying is that the General Data Protection Regulation integrates accountability as a principle which requires organizations to have appropriate technical and organizational measures to be able to demonstrate what they did and the effectiveness when requested. And they go on saying that the first step towards compliance with the GDPR's accountability principle is to make sure that you know where everything is and that you've got an inventory and that you track third parties and so on. So this is not a new concept. Now, if I look at the perspective on an attack, so as a criminal, obviously there's no borders with physical controls. The attacks are very simple, low risk type attacks with great impact potential. The skill levels of attackers or would-be attackers keeps going down. And then, of course, we as individuals, citizens, business people, government, we make way too much information available for criminals to gather. So, it's a case that we're kind of asking for it, so to speak. And we really, really need to make awareness levels go up. And I know that there's so many initiatives this month because of the Global Cyber Awareness Month, and we ourselves at VG Trust are doing an event every 2 to 3 days, and we're always happy to be part of cyber awareness events like this one. But I think that cyber awareness needs to be a continuous thing. It's not just in the month of October or on January 28th for Global Privacy Day. It's every day, and that's one thing that's one of the messages that I'd like you to leave with. Now, another thing to talk about with regards to cyber accountability is making sure that the key decision makers understand the difference between an incident and a breach. And so I'm referring to the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report here. We talk a lot about incidents and breaches, but an incident is a security event that may affect the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data or systems, but that doesn't result in a disclosure of data to unauthorized third parties that may legally need to be made public or put to the regulator or the enforcement body. So it's something that may or may not be serious, but that even if serious, does not require public disclosure. A breach is a security incident that definitely resulted in the confirmed disclosure, not just the potential exposure, but the confirmed disclosure of data to an authorized party. So the report for this year goes on looking at the top 6 areas in terms of tactics being utilized. So 45% of breaches featured hacking. Errors were causal events in 22% of the breaches. 22% included social attacks. And I spoke about the fact that we as individuals, as companies, and as governments make way too much information available that we really clearly should not be sharing. 17% involved malware, and that's very important. 8% of breaches were misused by authorized users. And what's important here is that it doesn't actually say whether it was an intentional error or a malicious error. And then finally, 4% of breaches were physical actions. Now, if you look at the top here for the actual top threat actions, you can see phishing and use of stolen credentials at the top, right? But if you look down, and you add up all of the ones that talk about malware on its own is actually the biggest one. And so it's something that we need to keep in touch and keep in mind. Now, as risk professionals, when we talk about risk, we tend to lose a lot of our colleagues that work in business units and in other business lines. The way we look at risk is by looking at a risk determination process like the one that you can see on your screen right now. So, for instance, you might say, okay, well, we have a number of assets. The assets are logical, physical, or processes. We group the assets within a scope that we need to protect for whatever reason. Either we're mandated to do that, like with PCI, or we decide to be in compliance with ISO or whatever. We then look at the risks against the assets within the scope. And we do a risk assessment, a risk analysis. We apply some controls that could be physical controls, technical controls, right, procedural controls, skills transfer, training, whatever. And then we end up with, we look at the probability, we look at the type of issues that might happen, we look at the probability and the potential impact. And then there's only really 4 things that you can do with risk. You either ignore it, which you should never do. You accept it as is. You try to reduce it further, or you decide to transfer the risk to some extent. But if you transfer the risk, you can only transfer the operation of the risk, so the operational aspect of managing the risk, or potentially transfer the risk or part of the risk through cyber insurance, but ultimately you still own the risk. So when we start talking about cyber risk to the board and to the key decision makers, generally speaking, what happens is we say, hey, we're taking credit card data, therefore we need to be in PCI, in compliance with PCI, therefore we need to have that type of security solution in place, because otherwise we're not protecting all the assets, and that is also in scope and all of that. And at that stage, you've already lost the board, right? And so what I don't want you to think is that the board doesn't understand risk, because the board does understand risk. That's their job. In fact, they deal with risk all the time. They deal with financial risk, with growth risk, with HR risk, with other legal risk. The challenge that we have as a community is we are not translating the cyber risk into a business risk that the board can actually deal with. We will lose them with as many acronyms as we can, because that's our comfort zone. And what we should be doing is demystifying the risk for them, because otherwise, when we talk about cyber risk and cyber accountability, we lose them very, very, very quickly. And they tend to panic and they don't know what to do. So we need to get them to understand that looking at security risk and at data risk can be not only a business enabler, but actually can end up with putting security as an asset on the balance sheet and on the P&L of the organization. Bear with me for a second on that. So if you look at what we're normally doing before we talk to the board and before we talk to the executives, we generally say, okay, well, we look at the asset discovery, we look at asset management tools, we use data discovery tools to find all the stuff that we're looking at, whether it's PII, whether it's like personal ID, banking, credit card holder data, personal health information, other type of sensitive information. We then classify the data via policy, potentially with a tool. We map the data and the flow of the data, and then we try to make that data unusable for malicious users and would-be attackers. So we tokenize it, we mask it, we truncate it, we use functional separation. We encrypt it at rest, obviously, we encrypt it in transit, and now we're starting to encrypt it in use. We back it up so that we have a proper backup, and then we make sure that we can recover. But the overall goal here is to put security on the balance sheet. How do you do that? Generally speaking, and the security industry is guilty of doing that for a number of years. We use FUD to get attention. We use fear, uncertainty, and doubt. What happens if we go and talk to the board and we say, what will happen if we're hacked is it's going to cost us in fines, it's going to cost us in disruption, it's going to cost us in many different things. And so the cost of dealing with a hack, let's say that we have 10,000 records that are being stolen or disclosed, The average cost, depending on the study that we're looking at, is going to be $20 to $40. So we multiply that, and then we put in a cost for fines, a cost for repairs, and so on. And that gives us generally a big number in the millions of dollars. And the reality is that some people might say, well, it would cost me more to try and prevent the hack from happening. And that is never, ever true. What we need to do instead is we need to say, let's take the investment that we do in cybersecurity assets, physical and logical assets and processes, and see which one of those we can actually put on the P&L as assets, even if they depreciate, which ones we can actually put in terms of this is helping us reduce the cost of insurance or whatever it is, and then turn that into a business enabler. And that's one of the key things that we need to do when we talk to the board. Now, in the book, The Cyber Elephant in the Boardroom, I talk about what I call the 5 stages of cyber grief. And the first one for the board is denial. Cyber, don't talk to me about it. It's not my role. My role is to grow the business, to make money for shareholders, to create employment. That's my role. Leave me alone. Then it's anger. Well, why are you bothering us with that? We already gave you money to recruit a CISO, a chief risk officer. We gave you money to buy firewalls. We gave you money to train some people. We gave you money to go to get a pen test done. So leave us alone. Talk to the CISO. They're here to help you. Bargaining. Oh, well, we're seeing that our competitors are being visited by the regulators or the enforcement bodies, or they're being hacked. So what we'll do is we'll hire a very reputable firm to come in and do an assessment of where we are. And if the regulator knocks at the door, we'll be able to say that we did take things seriously. And don't get me wrong, this is a good first step, but this is not the silver bullet. That's not good enough. Depression then comes in. Oh my God, the regulator is at the door. We have been hacked. We're never going to get out of this because we were using FUD instead of trying to turn security into a business enabler. And therefore, we don't know what to do. The final stage is acceptance. And guess what? It will be okay, because the reality is that most organizations have a firewall. Most organizations have security processes. Most organizations do some training. Most organizations have IDS, IPS, and so on. And maybe they haven't implemented all of that in a way that is allows them to demonstrate compliance with PCI, with HIPAA, with GDPR, CCPA, or whatever they're complying with. But they're probably doing a good job at where they're at. And the gap is really, how do we go from that 60, 70% to 100%? And what the regulator or the enforcement body is going to want to see is that you're in control of that 60, 70%. You know you have a gap and you have a roadmap to breach that gap. And so it's very important when we talk to the board, when we talk about cyber accountability, that we talk about those 5 stages, and we try to get the key decision makers to go to the acceptance stage as fast as we can. So in the cyber elephant in the boardroom, and the title, as you can guess, comes from the fact that cyber is the one issue that is the elephant in the boardroom that nobody wants to talk about. It's kind of there, but nobody really wants to address it. I talk about the 5 pillars of security framework, which I created about 12 years ago and won a number of awards. And it's based on the idea that whether you look at compliance with HIPAA, PCI, GDPR, CCPA, NERC, FERC, SEC, FDA, whether you look at generic security compliance and information governance in China with the new regulation in South Africa, in Kenya, in Australia, in the US, in France, in Ireland, and whether you're a big or a small company, you can always dial back to 5 common denominators that allow you to translate what you're trying to do into business language for the board. And so those pillars are those 5 pillars are physical security, people security, data security, infrastructure security, and crisis management. And infrastructure is really important, especially post-pandemic, because your infrastructure is more than your traditional networks behind your firewalls and your subsidiaries, your franchisees. It's also the wealth of remote users and remote data that you have now. It's your application security, it's your cloud, it's your everything, that it's the applications that you're creating and so on. And so we've built a very system process where you can educate the C-level and board people through face-to-face workshops and e-learning. They then can do what we call a super strategic maturity level assessment that has 25 questions, 5 per pillar. And then the C-level folks and the executive VPs can do the strategic one, which is a bit more operational with 60 questions, 12 questions per pillar. And the questions are very business driven. The answers are yes, absolutely. Yes, I think so. No, I don't know. No, I don't think so. I don't care. It's not my problem. It doesn't apply to my organization. And that allows you to bring up red flags and action items, because if a board member says, doesn't apply to our organization, but it should, or if they say we don't care, that is a red flag. And so you can use that as a maturity level. And by the way, all of this is available in the public domain on the VG Trust website. And we make the 5 pillars of security available on VG1 free of charge for board of directors and for C-level. So you can start using that at any time. In the end, that gives you an operational security and risk compliance program. And so I cover all of this in the book, and I'm delighted that I got an opportunity to showcase the book today. The book actually has three parts. The first part is my feedback as a veteran within the cyber security industry with 20 plus years experience in cyber. The second part is about the 5 pillars of security, the strategic and super strategic assessments, how you can use it and how you communicate that to the board. And then the third part is 10 guest chapters that have been written by members of the advisory board that look at security for the board, but from different angles, from the banking area, from critical infrastructure perspective. We have an amazing chapter from Alex Abramoff, past president of ISACA New York, around educating people. We have a number of CISOs. We've got Ed Adams from Security Innovation that's talking about software and software as a catalyst for today's business, digital business. Kathy Smith talks about digitization. We also have an amazing chapter on PCI from the VP of Compliance of Accor Hotel Group. And also a very good benchmarking of the 5 pillars for banking from Nina Shalepina, who's a member of our global advisory board and works in banking. And so it's not just my vision of how the 5 pillars can help you. It's also based on the on what our advisory board is doing. Now, I'm sure John mentioned that earlier on, but there is an event tomorrow evening at the M Social Hotel on 52nd and Broadway. It starts at 5 p.m. With a welcome drink, and from 5:30 to 6:15, we have a very informal discussion about cyber accountability and the book with some of the guest writers that I've just mentioned. And then after that, we have a happy hour for a couple of hours, a great opportunity to continue networking. I don't know about you, but I'm really looking forward to meeting people face to face again. Obviously, there are guidelines there for the hotel, but that's in the invite. I would love to have an opportunity to sign the book and give it to those of you who are attending. If you have any opportunities to promote to promote cyber accountability within your organization or whatever, if you'd like to talk about speaking engagements, I am very happy to do that. And with that, I think this is the end of my presentation. I'd be very happy to take questions if we have time. Not exactly sure how I did on time here, John.
You did great on time. You have a good 5-6 minutes for questions.
Great.
Actually, I see 2 questions that are pretty similar. It's about using the FAIR model. Is this method parallel or complementary to the FAIR model, or is how do you use FAIR to turn cyber risk into dollars at risk?
Yeah, I think they are complementary. The five pillars in itself is not the five pillars of security is not necessarily the silver bullet to turn cyber into an ammunition to show cybersecurity in dollars, whether it's in cost or it's in potential upside. But I do think that the FAIR model is one of them. In fact, the chapter written by Bob Gardner within the book talks about various methodologies to actually achieve that. So he's the expert on that front. I'm not, but I would like to refer you to his chapter.
Funny, speaking about of chapters, Alex Abramoff, who wrote a chapter in your book, was one of the founding members of this conference back in 2014 when he was part of ISOC in New York. So
That's
interesting.
correct. Yeah. And actually, Alex, I was actually speaking to Alex today. Alex is also the person that I credit for giving me the idea for the advisory board. So Alex and I go back a long way, and we were having a drink one day in New York after work, as one does. And I said, why don't you bring some of your peers to meet me? Maybe I can do business with them. And he said, well, why don't I bring a few peers? I pick the place and you pick up the tab. And I said, yeah, we'll give it a go.
That sounds
Uh,
like Alex.
well, we gave it a go, and it worked so well that we started doing events in private rooms in restaurants, over dinner, and then it kind of got a life of its own. And today we've got 700 members from 30 countries. We've got two chapters in the US, one for the East Coast and one for the rest of the US. And my guess is that as we grow, it's going to become more granular. But I do think it's very important for all of us to share experience and not just share what works, but, excuse my French, I'm French, so I can be very direct, but to also share where we sometimes screw up, and so that other people don't have to make the same mistakes.
And actually, the next two questions are probably back focus exactly on your experiences. So this one says, "What are your thoughts about having folks with a compliance background or experience as members of key IT operation groups?"
So I do think that it adds a lot of value, but I also think that the opposite is true, right? So you need people within the IT and the operational team that understand compliance so that they can communicate with the compliance people, especially with digitization processes, right? Because otherwise it's just done with regards to functionality for the end users and the buyers, and also with regards to time to market. So you do need IT and operational people that are compliance savvy. Equally, it's great to have compliance people and security people that understand that the objectives of the IT folks and the operational folks are to go to market and to allow the organization, the enterprise, to be much more agile. And so sometimes we do this without keeping security and compliance in mind. So you need both sides of the equation.
Great. Hey, last question here. For the average business, in your experience, what has been the impact of fines? The fines affect the bottom line, or are they just the cost of doing business? And I'll answer after you answer, but go ahead.
So I think that specifically in banking, there's a figure out there that is an open secret that most banks have um, a 1.4% budget to allocate to fines every year. And so therefore, they expect that they're going to be fined and they have a budget for it. So from that perspective, it's actually not a deterrent. For a private company, it is much more of a deterrent, but the larger organizations also have a budget for that. I do think that the fine is to get the attention, right? So the fines, especially the GDPR fines that are growing right now, they are massive, and we need to pay attention to that because we need to make sure that we are prepared for that. But the disruption to business is much more of an issue, and the ongoing aftermath of being breached from a reputational perspective is, in my view, probably more of a deterrent than the fine itself.
Yeah, it's funny you say that because I won't mention a large international bank that basically took advantage of some of the vulnerabilities in Swift, not once, not twice, but 3 times, and were fined heavily, and yet we're still doing it. And the only postulation we can come by is that it was the profit they made far outweighed the fines they were getting, so it was the cost of doing business. And even though they're under big scrutiny today, I'm sure we'll find a fourth instance of a
So
bypass.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that the concept of cyber accountability may get through to the board better in the countries where there are criminal charges. They can actually be liable as a person, not just as a director of an organization. So where your personal liability starts to be taken into account, never mind the fine, it's your reputation and in fact, your ability to make a livelihood. So, but I do think that goes back to fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I'm much more hopeful that by educating the boards, we can get them to see security as a positive. And yes, there is a cost of doing business, but there's a lot more opportunity than cost.
Great. So, Matthew, that's all the questions. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow night.
Thank you very much. And I hope that many of you can join tomorrow. Thanks again for the opportunity.